Fog blankets Merrifield as the bells toll. The town gathers to bury a farmer everyone respected. His death came suddenly, leaving no chance for goodbyes. The crowd stands in silence, but sorrow is laced with a strange sense of wrongness. As the ceremony begins, a wolf emerges from the mist. It locks eyes with the mourners, then leaps toward the coffin. Stay with us to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe, because many more thrilling tales are coming your way. The morning mist hung over the quiet hills of Merrifield like a memory not ready to let go. It curled through the pastures, coiled along the narrow dirt roads, and drifted silently between the weathered gravestones of the churchyard. As the bells tolled their mournful notes across the sleepy countryside, townsfolk gathered in dark coats and solemn silence, their faces creased not just by sorrow, but by confusion. No one had expected Elias Harlow's life to end so suddenly. And no one, not a single soul, could have anticipated what would come next. Elias had been a farmer for most of his 74 years. Known for his slow gait, sun-darkened skin, and the way he tilted his head slightly to the right when he listened, he had become a fixture in Merrifield, like the old barn near Route 11 or the rusting water tower that bore the town's fading name. He lived on the edge of the valley, where the land met the forest and the wild things still wandered. His house was modest, built with his own hands long before the war. Long before the world changed. There, he raised 3 children, buried one, and learned to live alone when his wife died beneath the weight of an illness no doctor could name. The years after that became quieter, slower, filled with routines. He tended his land. He read weathered books by the window. He drank bitter coffee and kept to himself. But beneath that stillness, there was a current, something unsaid, something waiting. The day he died was ordinary. Blue sky, warm wind, the distant sound of children playing somewhere past the trees. Neighbors found him slumped near his well, as if he had paused to rest and simply never stood up again. There was no violence, no foul play, just the kind of death that arrives on tiptoes. Quick. Quiet. Undeniable. The town mourned him, yes, but there was a deeper hesitation in their grief, a question unspoken: what would happen to the land? The animals? The stories he never told? His eldest son, Thomas, who had left for the city years ago and rarely returned, arranged the funeral. It was to be simple, respectful. No eulogies, no performances. Just a farewell. And yet, what unfolded that morning was anything but simple. The church, draped in shadows and candlelight, seemed to resist the sunlight entirely. Flowers lined the aisle, pale and trembling in the hush. Elias's casket, handcrafted from pine and fastened with iron latches, rested beneath the crucifix, his hat folded gently atop it. The congregation stood, heads bowed. A hymn played from a distant speaker, hollow and unsure. Then, a sound. It came from beyond the church doors. A low, deliberate growl, followed by the sharp scrape of claws on stone. Some thought it a stray dog. Others assumed a coyote from the forest had wandered too far. But the moment the doors creaked open, letting in a flood of white fog and a sudden gust of cold air, every head turned. And there he stood. A wolf. Not large, but unmistakable. Lean, silver-furred, eyes burning with intelligence and something else, something mournful. He stepped forward, unafraid. Silent. He did not snarl. He did not bark. He simply walked down the aisle like a mourner who had every right to be there. Gasps rippled through the room. Some backed away. A woman clutched her child tightly. But the wolf ignored them all. With slow, measured steps, he approached the coffin. He sniffed the air, lowered his head, and leapt. His paws thudded against the wood with a force that made it shake, flowers tumbling to the ground. Before anyone could react, the wolf pressed his snout to Elias's throat and bit down. Not with rage, not with violence, but with purpose. Panic erupted. Someone screamed. A chair clattered to the ground. But as they rushed forward to stop the creature, something happened that froze them all in place. Elias moved. A shudder. A spasm. Then, a cough. Wet, desperate, alive. The church fell into stunned silence as the old farmer's chest rose. His eyes fluttered open. Confusion painted his face. The wolf, blood on his snout, stepped back from the coffin and stood guard. People later spoke of miracles, of resurrection, of strange pacts between man and beast. But no one could deny what they saw, a dead man, brought back, not by medicine, but by the teeth of a creature that should have never been there. As the medics arrived, as they carried Elias into the waiting ambulance, the wolf vanished. Slipped out through the open door and disappeared into the fog. By the time anyone thought to follow, there was no trace of him. Just pawprints on the stone floor. And silence. But that silence was not empty. It was the kind that listens. The kind that waits. Because this story had only just begun. The hospital was quiet when Elias Harlow opened his eyes for the second time that day. This time, the light was artificial, pale, buzzing, cold. Machines hummed nearby, soft beeping punctuated the silence, and a nurse sat not far from his bedside, her eyes wide with disbelief. It had been nearly 2 hours since the incident at the church, and no one had yet found the words to describe what had happened, let alone explain it. Elias blinked slowly, adjusting to the light, the scent of antiseptic, the weight of the 4 in his arm. His mind felt heavy, as though dragged from some great depth. He remembered walking to the well. He remembered the sound of the wind through the trees. And then, nothing. Nothing until now. Or, no. Not quite. There had been something. A feeling. Warm breath. The brush of fur. A flash of gold eyes staring into his own, steady and unflinching. He didn't speak, not at first. When he did, it was only to ask for water, his voice a brittle whisper. Doctors surrounded him quickly, poking, checking, asking questions. Thomas stood in the doorway, pale and quiet, his phone limp in his hand. They said it had been anaphylaxis, a severe allergic reaction. Something he'd eaten, maybe something he hadn't known about. They explained how his throat had closed, how his body had shut down, how he had displayed all the signs of death. And yet, here he was. The attending physician hesitated before offering one more detail. Something about Elias's throat. A wound, clean, precise, situated just below the larynx. The kind of incision you might make to clear an airway in an emergency. A tracheostomy. But there had been no scalpel, no surgical tools. Just torn flesh. The unmistakable imprint of sharp canines. No one could explain how that could have helped him breathe. No one could understand how it had worked. But it had. Somehow, it had. Thomas wanted to keep it quiet. Wanted the story buried with the disbelief. But that was never going to happen. Not in a town like Merrifield. By the next morning, the local paper ran a front-page headline that simply read, "Wolf saves dead man at funeral." The story spiraled. Reporters called. Cars lined the dusty road leading to Elias's farm, their tires kicking up familiar dirt in a town unused to strangers. But Elias stayed silent. He said nothing, offered no interviews, refused visitors. When the doctors deemed him well enough to leave, he returned home without ceremony. And the house welcomed him like a patient dog, unchanged, untouched, still breathing in rhythm with the land. That first night back, Elias stood on his porch long after the sun had gone. The stars above were clear, sharp as broken glass. The trees rustled, full of secrets. He felt the memory of the wolf like a bruise just under his ribs. Not just the bite, though it ached in cold air, but the presence. The knowing. It hadn't been the first time he saw that animal. Not by a long shot. Years ago, back when the forest still whispered like an old friend and not a warning. Elias had wandered deeper than usual while chasing down a missing calf. The summer had been dry, the creeks running low, the underbrush crackling underfoot. He had found the calf, eventually, tangled in brush and bleeding. But he had also found something else. A wolf. Young, thin, and barely clinging to life. Caught in a snare meant for rabbits. The wire had dug deep into its hind leg, red with rot, eyes glazed over in pain. Elias should have left it. Should have walked away. But something in its gaze, a flicker of will, maybe even trust, made him stay. He remembered kneeling. Talking to the animal in soft murmurs even as it growled through clenched teeth. He remembered cutting the wire, ignoring the risk. Carrying the wolf back in the bed of his truck, blood soaking into his flannel. The decision had not been made with logic. It had been instinct. A quiet promise passed between one soul and another. Elias had kept the wolf in his barn, hidden from the town, from his children, from the men who bragged about what they'd shoot if it came too close to their fences. He used the same tools he'd once used to birth calves and dress wounds on hogs. He fed the wolf scraps of venison, fresh eggs, cool water. And in time, the animal healed. But it didn't leave. Not at first. It lingered on the edge of his property like a ghost. Watching him from the shadows. Sometimes approaching, never fully tamed. There was no leash, no collar, no ownership. Only recognition. Mutual understanding. Years passed. Visits grew rare. Then rarer. But never ended. Even in Elias's loneliest moments, when the fields were empty and the farmhouse echoed with nothing but wind, he knew he wasn't truly alone. And now, after all this time, it had returned. Not just returned, but saved him. As if a pact had been honored. A debt paid in flesh and breath. He wondered where it was now. If it still watched him from the trees. If it remembered the nights by the firelight and the whispered words of an old man who had once believed in wild things. The forest remained silent. But Elias could feel it. Waiting. The days that followed unfolded like forgotten pages in a journal, slow, uneven, steeped in the surreal. Elias moved through them as if dreaming, each moment soaked in echoes. The routine of farm life had returned with a mechanical rhythm. Feeding the chickens, inspecting the fence posts, walking the perimeter of the land. But everything felt different, slightly off-kilter. The soil beneath his boots seemed more alive, the wind sharper in his ears. The taste of well water on his tongue was richer. Even the silence, that deep, familiar quiet of isolation, was charged now. Electric. Like the land itself held its breath. He began to notice things. Small things at first, a tuft of gray fur caught on the porch rail. Paw prints near the edge of the corn rows, where no dogs wandered and no deer ever strayed. A feather, black and glistening, resting atop his windowsill without breeze enough to place it there. The old wind chime by the barn, silent for years, began to sing on windless nights. Elias didn't mention any of it when Thomas came to visit that weekend, city nerves twitching behind a concerned smile. The boy, though not much of a boy anymore, had brought groceries and questions. Neither of which Elias had asked for. He let Thomas speak, nodding when expected, smiling in the hollow way one does when the words don't matter but the voice does. They didn't talk about the wolf. Not really. Thomas mentioned it once, in passing, with the same tone someone might use to describe a bad dream they weren't sure was real. Elias said nothing. Not because he was hiding something, but because he didn't need to explain. Some things, when spoken aloud, begin to shrink. He didn't want this to shrink. Later that night, after Thomas had gone and the house had settled into its familiar hush, Elias sat by the fire. The bite mark on his neck still pulsed when he pressed his fingers against it, the skin tender but clean. No infection. No swelling. The doctor had said it was healing unusually well, and Elias hadn't replied. He'd simply buttoned his collar and walked out into the sun. Now, he felt that same fire inside his bones. It wasn't painful, not quite. More like a humming. A presence. That's when he saw them. Eyes. At first, just a glimmer, twin shards of gold caught in the tree-line. He didn't rise. Didn't flinch. The wolf stood half in shadow, fur silver blue in the moonlight, posture still and patient. They watched each other for a long moment, like two men sitting across a chessboard with no need to move. Then, the wolf stepped forward. Slow. Measured. Each paw fall soundless across the grass. Elias felt his breath catch in his throat as the animal drew closer, until it stood just beyond the porch steps. The wolf's gaze held his like a tether, steady and unreadable. It sat. Tilted its head slightly, the way it had all those years ago in the barn. Recognition gleamed behind its gaze. And Elias knew. This was the same wolf. Older now, yes. Stronger. But unmistakably the same. For a time, neither moved. The world itself seemed to pause, crickets held their song, the breeze stilled, the stars brightened. Then, gently, the wolf rose and turned, padding back into the dark with the ease of something that belonged to it. Not fleeing. Not retreating. Leading. Elias stood, his knees crackling with age and disuse, and followed. He took no lantern. No cane. Just the heavy warmth of his coat and the instinct to move forward. Through tall grass and brush, across the narrow stream that bordered his property. The wolf never looked back. It didn't need to. They traveled deeper than Elias had gone in years, past familiar landmarks, past the old fence he had once mended by hand, past the hollow where his youngest daughter had broken her wrist falling from a tree. The forest grew thicker here, darker, the scent of pine and damp earth thick in the air. And still, he followed. Eventually, they reached a clearing. Small. Circular. Perfect. At its center stood a stone. Not large, barely reaching his knee, but unmistakably placed. Weathered and ancient, covered in moss and time. It bore no writing, no carvings, only a faint, natural depression at its top, as though water had once pooled there. Around it grew tall grass and wildflowers, out of season and yet defiantly alive. The wolf stopped at the edge of the clearing and sat again. Elias approached the stone. Something inside him stirred, not memory, not emotion. Something older. A recognition not of the mind, but of the marrow. He knelt slowly, brushing his fingers across the cold surface of the stone. A warmth spread through his chest. Not heat. Light. It radiated from within, pulsing with his breath, his heartbeat. And with it came sound, not from the forest, but from the very earth. A low, rumbling note, like a distant choir of wind and roots and blood. It was beautiful. Terrifying. Sacred. He looked back toward the wolf. It was gone. But Elias wasn't alone. Something had awakened. Something ancient, patient, and now, watching. And in that moment, under stars older than scripture, Elias Harlow understood, his return from death had not been an accident. It was an invitation. And it had only just begun. Elias didn't speak of the stone. Not to Thomas. Not to the doctors, who still called now and then with quiet disbelief in their voices. Not even to the pastor, who had visited the farm once since the funeral, bringing with him a basket of dried herbs and eyes full of questions. The stone remained his secret, or rather, not a secret, but a knowing too vast to reduce with words. He returned to the clearing the following night. The path was easier this time. As though the forest had remembered him. The trees seemed to lean back just slightly, and the thorns that once scratched at his legs had withered or drawn away. The grass bent beneath his steps, not breaking, just moving aside. The stone was as he left it, though the air around it hummed now, a frequency he felt in the back of his teeth. When he knelt again, his hands trembling with a reverence he didn't fully understand, the stone felt warmer than before. More alive. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, he wasn't in the clearing. He was standing beside himself. Watching. Like an echo made flesh, he saw himself kneeling. Saw the wolf behind him. Saw the flickering of flames not from fire, but from within the ground itself. Shapes moved in the trees, tall, long-limbed, silent. Not men. Not beasts. Not threatening, but old. And then he was back. Heart pounding, breath shallow, the scent of the forest thick in his lungs. He sat for a long time after that. Listening. Letting the quiet speak. When he finally stood and began the walk back to the farmhouse, the stars above felt closer, as if pressing down. He didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. His dreams, if he had them, were not his own. And when dawn finally peeled across the sky, he felt changed. Not just awakened. Marked. Over the next weeks, life on the farm took on an altered shape. Everything still functioned, but with a rhythm that no longer belonged entirely to Elias. He found himself waking before the first bird call, rising with the sound of distant rustling trees that hadn't moved. The crops, though neglected, showed no sign of it. Weeds didn't grow. Pests stayed away. The old sycamore that had been dying since the frost of '98 began to bloom. Strangers began to visit. Not many, and not loudly. They came on foot, from places Elias did not recognize, dressed in clothes that blended with wind and stone. They never approached the house, never stepped beyond the edge of the field. But he saw them, watching, waiting, nodding. Once, a child among them smiled and placed something in the grass before vanishing into the treeline. Elias found it the next morning. A ring made of woven bark and feathers, no larger than a coin. When he touched it, he felt a faint vibration, like the memory of a song. He placed it on the porch rail. It vanished by dusk. One night, rain came. Not the slow drizzle of spring or the hard slap of summer storms, this was a rain older than calendars. It fell with purpose. The air grew thick and metallic, the kind of storm that made the dogs howl and the insects vanish. Thunder rumbled like something dragging chains beneath the clouds. Elias stood outside, face turned upward, arms bare. He let the rain strike him, let it soak his clothes, trail into the corners of his eyes and mouth. It wasn't cold. It was cleansing. And then, through the haze of water and wind, he saw the wolf. Standing at the edge of the field. Behind it, barely visible, stood two others. Not wolves, not exactly. Larger. More upright. Their shapes shimmered in the rain like they weren't entirely bound to this world. Eyes that gleamed like carved bone. They watched Elias, silent and unmoving. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. But not without a trace. Where they had stood, 3 symbols were burned into the ground. Not with fire, but with light. Pale and pulsing. One resembled a spiral, the other a crescent, the third a hand with 5 extended fingers, no thumb. Elias touched them. the world shifted again. This time, the vision was clearer. He stood in the same clearing, but the stone was gone. In its place, a well, deep, black, and humming. Around him stood others. Men. Women. Some wore cloaks of animal hide. Others were painted in ash and ochre. And all of them bowed toward him. He wasn't Elias in this vision. He was something else. Their guide. Their bridge. The one who had walked between life and death, and returned. When the vision faded, Elias found himself on his knees in the field, soaked and shivering, the symbols still glowing faintly beneath his palms. He understood something then. The wolf had not chosen him out of gratitude. It had not saved him out of debt. It had answered a call. A call Elias never knew he made, not with voice, but with the life he had lived. With the choices he'd made. The years of solitude. The kindness to the broken creature in the barn. The reverence he had shown the land. The wolf had not saved him. It had awakened him. The others, whatever they were, had accepted him. But acceptance was only the beginning. Something waited beneath the soil, beneath memory, beneath time. And soon, it would rise. The morning after the storm, the land was still. Not just in the usual sense, the hush of post-rain calm, the softened light, the slow return of birdsong. This was different. A stillness that felt intentional. Watching. Listening. Elias rose early, not from habit, but from something deeper pulling him out of sleep before the sun had climbed the hills. He stood barefoot on the porch, the wood damp beneath his feet, and scanned the field. The symbols were gone. No trace of the spiral, the crescent, or the hand remained, at least not to the eye. But he could feel them. Like heat rising from beneath the earth. His skin still tingled where his palms had touched the ground the night before, and the back of his throat held a coppery taste, as if he'd bitten into memory itself. Inside the house, the walls felt closer than usual, the air too still. So he walked. Not toward the clearing this time, but toward the northern edge of the property, the part he rarely visited. It bordered a ridge that overlooked the old logging trail, long since abandoned and overgrown with thorns and brambles. Something had always felt off about that stretch of land. Not dangerous, exactly. Just forgotten. Today, it called to him. His boots crunched through wet grass, past the low stone wall he'd built decades ago with his youngest son, now buried states away. The trees ahead grew closer together here, darker bark, older roots. Birds didn't sing. No insects hummed. Even the wind changed tone as it passed through these woods, deeper, more hollow, like breath exhaled through a vast chamber. Halfway up the ridge, he saw it. A tree. Massive. Crooked. Ancient beyond reckoning. Its bark was blackened as though burned, but not by fire. By time. Vines crawled along its twisted frame like veins, and at its base sat a hollow large enough for a man to stand in. The moment Elias stepped into its shadow, the air shifted. Warmer. Denser. Inside the hollow, he found a bundle. Cloth, coarse and woven, wrapped tight with sinew and stained with dark circles. Carefully, reverently, he unwrapped it. Inside was a collection of bones. Not human. Not entirely animal. Each one etched with fine carvings, not words, but symbols. The same ones from the field. Beneath the bones was a mask. Simple. Wooden. Smooth, save for two narrow eye slits and a curved mouth. Painted in ash and ochre, the same colors from the vision. Elias held it in his hands, the wood warm despite the damp air. As he stared into the mask's empty gaze, he felt a presence press against him, not from outside, but within. A rush of memory not his own. He stood in snow. A circle of people surrounded him, each wearing the same mask. Firelight flickered across their faces, their breath fogging the night air. A voice, deep, female, ancient, spoke a word that had no translation. And all around him, the trees leaned forward to listen. He blinked. The vision vanished. But the weight of it remained. He brought the bundle back to the farmhouse, careful not to disturb the pattern of bones. He cleared a space in the cellar where the stone was cool and the earth exposed. Placing the mask on a shelf carved into the wall. Then, without thinking, he knelt. And waited. That night, the wolf returned. No approach this time. No hesitation. Elias woke from a shallow sleep to find it standing at the foot of his bed, eyes glowing like embers. The room was bathed in pale light, though the moon had yet to rise. The wolf watched him with the same expression it had always worn, unreadable, calm, old. But this time, it was not alone. In the doorway stood a woman. Tall. Barefoot. Dressed in garments woven from bark and grass and something that shimmered in the corner of the eye but vanished if looked at directly. Her hair hung in damp strands over her shoulders, dark as oil. Her face bore a softness Elias couldn't place, both young and ancient. Around her neck hung a charm shaped like the spiral. She didn't speak. She only extended her hand. Elias rose. Took it. The moment their palms met, his knees buckled. Not from weakness, but from force. The floor vanished. The house vanished. The walls of his life fell away like leaves burned to ash. He stood beneath a sky unlike any he had ever seen, not black, but a deep violet full of pulsing lights. Trees around him swayed not from wind, but from something deeper. From intention. The stars overhead moved, not fast, but with purpose. They rearranged themselves into patterns he did not understand but recognized just the same. The woman stood beside him now, mask in hand. She lifted it and placed it over his face. Darkness. Then, sound. Low at first, like footsteps on wet stone. Then rising, a chant. A name not his own. A name he somehow remembered. It echoed inside his chest, inside the spaces between his ribs. The chant grew until it became breath, and breath became fire. When he awoke, morning had come. He lay on the cellar floor, dirt clinging to his back, the mask resting beside him. And on the wall, freshly carved, though by no tool he owned, were the three symbols. The spiral. The crescent. The hand. This time, each pulsed with a soft, red glow. Outside, the wind had shifted. Animals moved differently now. Birds circled slower. Foxes stood longer at the edge of fields. Even the cows at the neighboring ranch refused to pass through the northern fence line. The air tasted older, and rain didn't fall the way it used to, not in drops, but in streaks, like something trying to write in the sky. Thomas called again, this time with worry in his voice. He had read a blog post. Some woman from another town had come to Merrifield to feel the energy, and hadn't returned. Her car was found parked near the trailhead. No signs of a struggle, no prints, no trail. Just, gone. Elias listened. And he understood. The veil was thinning. The boundary between what was once and what will be had begun to tear, and he, Elias Harlow, had become its thread. Not chosen. Not forced. Simply, necessary. That night, the wolf returned once more. This time, it spoke. Not with voice. Not with language. But with memory. And what it showed Elias, would change everything. The vision came not like a dream, but like drowning. Elias fell backward through the wolf's gaze, into memory not his own. A memory so old it had no shape, only sensations. Fire. Mud. Screaming winds across bare hills. He was no longer Elias. He had no name here. He was breath, and bone, and watching. He stood, or floated, or existed, at the edge of a vast, burning plain. The sky above was a color that no longer existed in this world, pulsing between orange and violet, as if it couldn't make up its mind. In the center of the plain, something writhed. Not a creature, not entirely. Not alive, not yet. It was being built, piece by piece, from bone and blood and stolen fire. Not by hands. By will. Figures moved in a circle around it, tall, thin, veiled in smoke. They did not walk. They slid. Their arms were long, and their eyes glowed in sockets where no skin remained. They chanted in a tongue Elias did not know, but felt in the marrow of his teeth. The chant held power. Binding. Awakening. Then, a shift. One of them turned. Looked directly at him. Not the body he inhabited. Him. Elias. Across the centuries. Across the veil. The creature raised one impossibly long finger and pointed. The chant faltered. The others stopped moving. The thing on the ground, the writhing shape, froze. In that stillness, a voice carved itself into his spine. You were meant to sleep. Then the world screamed and collapsed. Elias gasped, clawing at the dirt floor of the cellar, breath scraping through his throat like rusted wire. The wolf was gone. The mask lay beside him again, unmoved, but it pulsed faintly now, as if something inside it had begun to breathe. He staggered to his feet and lit the lantern hanging from the ceiling beam. The flickering flame cast dancing shadows across the carvings on the wall, the spiral, the crescent, the hand. They had changed. Slightly. Subtly. The spiral had opened. The crescent had deepened. And the hand now had a sixth finger. He touched the carvings. The wood beneath his fingers was warm. Beating. He pulled his hand away and stared at his palm. 3 red marks now glowed where he had pressed it, a perfect echo of the symbols. He stumbled up the stairs, boots thudding heavily across the old boards. The house groaned as he moved through it, no longer just old, but alive. Watching. Breathing with him. In the kitchen, he collapsed into the chair by the window. Outside, the world looked unchanged. Trees swayed. Mist curled along the ground. But he knew it was all thinner now. Less real. The boundary was no longer holding. And the thing he had seen, the being half-formed and waiting, was waking again. In town, things had started to fray. 3 more people had gone missing, one a boy from the community college, the others tourists drawn by rumors of the resurrection wolf. All of them had vanished along trails near the forest's edge. Authorities wrote it off as accidents, exposure, disorientation. But those who knew the woods, the real woods, whispered of something older. The forest, they said, was hungry again. Stories began to resurface. Tales Elias hadn't heard in 50 years. Stories whispered by old hunters at the edge of campfires, of the hollowing, of the step beyond the veil, of the one who comes after fire. Myths wrapped in madness, passed down through generations too afraid to write them down. And in all of them, always, the wolf appeared. Not as a predator. But as a herald. A warning. Elias sat in silence, letting the weight of it all sink into him. He was not the first. That much was clear. Others had walked this path before, masked, marked, chosen. But something had gone wrong. Long ago. Something had been broken. And now the land was shifting, trying to remember what had been lost. And repair it. Or reopen it. That evening, as the sun bled gold across the hills, Elias walked the fields. He needed to see the place again. To feel the soil. To understand where the seams were thinning. He passed the barn, still standing, still silent, and paused at the spot where he'd once nursed the injured wolf all those years ago. The floorboard where the animal had lain was still warped from the blood. He knelt. Pressed his fingers to the wood. The moment he did, a wind surged through the barn, strong enough to scatter straw and rattle the rusted hinges. The door slammed shut behind him, and the lantern flickered violently. Then, silence. A whisper moved through the rafters. Low. Unhuman. You opened the breath. Elias stood slowly. The air shimmered. Dust floated upward, not down. Shapes moved behind the grain sacks, impossible shapes, too tall, too thin, too fast. He turned and faced the mirror. There was no mirror in the barn. But there it stood, an ancient glass set into the wall where hay once hung. And in its surface, Elias did not see himself. He saw the masked version. Standing. Waiting. Then the image stepped forward. Through the glass. Elias woke in bed. Clothes damp with sweat. Nails caked with dirt. The mask lay on his chest. And outside, in the distance, drums had begun to sound. Not man-made. Not from speakers or instruments. Drums from the ground. From deep beneath. The earth itself was calling. The wolf had warned him. But now it was time for something more. Something that would test the shape of his soul. Because the veil was not only thinning, it was choosing. And Elias Harlow had been chosen. The drums continued through the night. Soft at first, like distant thunder rolling beneath the hills, but growing with each hour, louder, closer, more deliberate. They didn't follow any rhythm Elias recognized. Not tribal. Not ceremonial. They were something else. Something that sounded like a question being asked over and over in a language the body understood but the mind could not translate. And the land responded. Around the Harlow farm, the trees began to tilt ever so slightly, as if drawn toward a central point. The wind shifted its path, circling in loops rather than gusting straight across. Lights flickered in the corners of vision, but vanished when looked at directly. Cattle from neighboring farms refused to cross certain fences. Dogs howled in unison at nothing. The world was turning in place. Elias stayed indoors for 2 days. Not out of fear. But preparation. He read the old journals tucked away in the crawlspace beneath his floor, books kept by his grandfather and great-grandfather, whose entries had long been dismissed as the ramblings of men touched by solitude. But now he saw them for what they were, accounts. Warnings. Maps written in metaphor and madness. One entry stood out. Scrawled in shaky script, almost frantic. When the blood of the sky touches the spine of the earth, he will awaken again. And the wolves will gather at the threshold. One must walk the crossing. Not with sword. Not with fire. But with memory. Memory. Elias repeated the word aloud, and the house shivered. That night, he returned to the cellar. The carvings on the wall had spread. New symbols now grew out of the original 3, branching like roots. The 6th finger on the hand had multiplied. The spiral had begun to twist inward on itself, impossibly deep. And the crescent had cracked. In the center of the room lay the mask. It pulsed softly, as though breathing. This time, Elias did not hesitate. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, and placed it over his face. There was no vision. No fall. No scream. Only silence. A silence so complete it became a presence. He stood in the dark. No floor, no sky. Just a void. And in that stillness, something spoke. But not with words. It showed him. A memory, not his own. A cave. Stone etched with bone dust. A child, weeping. A mother, faceless, humming a song that made the cave walls glow. A blade buried in a man's chest, not to kill, but to release. A well that breathed. A god that bled. Then, a door. Massive. Carved from the petrified remains of something long dead. It pulsed with golden veins, and each beat seemed to echo through Elias's ribs. The door was chained shut with lengths of twisted root and woven hair. And behind it, movement. Heavy. Endless. Patient. The message was clear. Do not open it. But it was already opening. The mask dissolved from his face. Elias fell backward onto the cellar floor with a grunt, gasping for breath. Blood trickled from his nose. His ears rang. The carvings on the walls now bled light, not red, but deep amber, like sap from an ancient tree. Upstairs, the drums stopped. In their place, came footsteps. Not on wood. On stone. Stone that wasn't part of this house. Stone that hadn't existed here for generations. The sound came from beneath the floor, from the earth itself. As if something had awakened in the foundation. Something walking slowly. Rising. Elias crawled toward the stairs. But he wasn't alone anymore. The wolf was waiting at the top step. Not sitting. Not calm. Its fur was bristled, eyes wide, body low to the ground. Not afraid, alert. Ready. It growled low, not at Elias, but at the dark below. Behind Elias, the cellar groaned. He didn't look back. He climbed the stairs, hand on the wall for balance, and stepped into the kitchen. Outside, the wind screamed, not like air, but like a voice dragged across a throat of stone. The stars above were wrong. They twisted slowly, spiraling inward like the symbol on his cellar wall. A blood moon rose, too fast, too large, bathing the fields in crimson. And then came the howls. Not one. Hundreds. From every direction. The wolves had gathered. Elias stepped onto the porch, the wolf beside him. In the distance, dark shapes moved across the fields. Not just animals. Not just beasts. Shapes like men with broken spines, tall and hunched, antlers growing from their skulls like crowns made from bone. They moved slowly, deliberately, toward the house. The wolf growled louder now. But did not move. Elias understood. He wasn't meant to run. He was meant to receive them. He lit the lantern. And waited. They arrived in silence. Not a snarl, not a breath. The antlered ones formed a wide circle around the house, staring with eyes that glowed like dying coals. Among them stood wolves, some ordinary, some twisted by something far older. Their fur bore runes. Their mouths held teeth too numerous, too sharp. The wolf at Elias's side stepped forward. The others parted. And from the center of the circle, came her. The woman. The same one from the vision. From the masked place. She walked barefoot through the grass as if the earth itself pulled away to greet her steps. Her eyes met Elias's, and for the first time, he felt something cold run through him. Recognition. Not hers. His. He had known her once. Before names. Before bones. She stood before him, lifted a hand, and pointed to the field behind the barn. Elias turned. And there, where the corn once grew, the earth had opened. A door. The same door. Golden veins. Woven roots. Pulsing, waiting. The wolves howled in unison. Elias stepped forward and crossed the threshold. The threshold was neither cold nor warm, it was simply absence. Of weight. Of sound. Of time. The moment Elias stepped through the door in the field, the world above ceased to matter. The wind vanished. The stars disappeared. Even the ache in his bones seemed to dissolve into the air like mist off the morning grass. He descended. There were no stairs, no slope. Just a steady pull downward through layers of space that were not made for human feet. Around him, the walls pulsed with light, amber veins glowing faintly through stone that seemed to breathe, exhaling cool air that smelled of moss, blood, and distant rain. The mask he had once worn, the wooden face of something lost to time, was back in his hands, though he could not recall picking it up. It felt heavier now. Fuller. It pulsed in sync with the light in the walls, as though it too was tied to the roots of this place. He did not know how long he walked. Time was no longer a thing to measure here. It stretched and bent, pulled taut, then snapped. Sometimes it felt like minutes. Sometimes lifetimes. At one point, he passed a stone archway carved with symbols he could now read without knowing why. A language made from hunger and memory. It spoke. The first remembering is the price of return. The tunnel opened into a chamber. Circular. Immense. Lit by nothing, yet visible in every detail. Bones covered the floor. Not as remains, but as a mosaic, laid carefully. Reverently, thousands of interlocking fragments forming patterns too vast to take in. Spiral formations nested within other spirals. Hands reaching into mouths. Mouths screaming into eyes. At the center of the floor, a basin carved into the stone. Empty, except for a single black feather floating weightless above it, slowly turning. Elias stepped forward. The wolf was there already. Standing on the far side of the basin, still and watchful. Behind it, the woman. Taller now. Her eyes deeper. Her voice, when it came, did not pass through the air, but entered his mind like smoke through an open window. You are the last. Elias opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Only memory. His own life folding backward, the touch of his wife's hand, the cry of his newborn son, the warm breath of the wolf in the barn, the first sunset he watched alone after returning from war. The basin filled with light. The feather dissolved into the glow, and from its center rose a shape, not solid, but shadow rendered with purpose. A face without features. A mouth without sound. And still, it spoke. Not in voice. In truth. Elias fell to his knees. It poured into him like molten water. Every choice he had made. Every kindness. Every cruelty left unspoken. The years of silence. The aching grief of outliving all he loved. The slow acceptance that no one was coming to save him. And still, the choice he made to save another. A wounded animal. A creature hunted. That choice, a single, small mercy, had lit a signal in the old blood. A beacon. And now he was here. You are the bridge, the shadow said. The breath between death and memory. The silence that binds the waking. Elias clutched the mask to his chest. The carvings on it began to shift, not visibly, but in the mind. He could feel them moving, realigning, revealing. He was not just a man anymore. He was a vessel. And something wanted to step through. He stood again, unsteady, and turned to face the woman. Her form had changed. Now cloaked in robes made of living roots and feathers, her face blurred as if it refused to be defined. She raised a hand, and the chamber responded. From the walls, wolves emerged. Dozens. Not walking, but gliding, part of the air, part of the stone. Each one stopped in a perfect ring around Elias, watching, breathing in unison. Their eyes were lit with the fire of stars. And then the howling began. But it wasn't sound. Not to the ears. It was memory. Each wolf sang a part of a life, not Elias's, but others. A farmer who died in a flood and became river song. A woman who sang wolves back to their bodies beneath a blood eclipse. A child born with no face who could speak the names of trees. All of them fragments of something older. The old chorus. Elias felt himself fading, not dying, but dissolving, piece by piece, until only meaning remained. And in that moment, the woman stepped forward and placed her hands on either side of his head. He did not flinch. He closed his eyes. And when he opened them again, he saw the world as it truly was. Not fields and houses and seasons. But layers of breath and bone. Veins of light in the soil. Places where the air was thin, where the others pressed close, waiting. Waiting for the vessel. Waiting for the man who had once died. Waiting for Elias. The chamber cracked. A fracture, thin, bright, pulsing. Through it came the sound of fire, not burning, but building. The wolves howled louder. The woman began to speak in a voice that shook the floor, and the feather-light shadow above the basin screamed silently. The mask in Elias's hands melted into light. The decision came not as a choice, but a return. He stepped forward into the fracture. And the world screamed open. Crossing the fracture was not like stepping into another world, it was like becoming it. The moment Elias passed through the split in the chamber, his body lost all sense of weight and boundary. There was no falling, no floating. Only unfolding. As if he had always been more than flesh, and now, for the first time, he was allowed to remember. He became light. Then soil. Then breath in the lungs of the forest. He moved across time not as a traveler, but as a thread, woven through lives and deaths, names and namelessness. Every person who had ever walked the veil before him, every marked one, every keeper of the mask, every silent guardian, they were not before him. They were within him. He saw them clearly, men with eyes like storm glass, women who sang in forgotten tongues to trees that bent in reply, wolves with bone-white fur and voices that moved across generations. They had all come here. To the between. The place before gods. The space memory goes when it's too heavy for the world. And now it welcomed him as one of its own. The land he now stood upon was not land at all. It was shaped like a forest, but it breathed. The trees swayed though there was no wind. Their leaves shimmered with pale bioluminescence, casting light in rippling waves like water. The sky above pulsed with colors too deep to name, and moved with slow intent, like something alive beneath a thin layer of skin. Beneath his feet, the ground whispered. Not with words. But with reminders. The boy who followed a ghost deer into this place and never returned. The woman who buried her daughter beneath a flowering tree and heard her laugh again in this realm. The hunter who became the hunted, and in doing so, found peace. Each step Elias took echoed with a life, a choice, a fracture. The wolves followed. Dozens. Silent now, reverent. And ahead, at the heart of this place, rose a structure. Not built. Grown. It pulsed like a living wound in the forest. Vines wrapped its sides, woven with teeth, bones, and feathers. It stood tall and narrow, like a cathedral carved from the ribs of a forgotten god. At its peak, a spiral window, glowing softly. Beneath it, a great door, locked not by latch or chain, but by memory itself. Elias approached. And the wolves did not follow. They stood at the tree line, heads bowed, as the woman appeared once more. She stood beside the doorway, robed in light and silence. Her face still unreadable, her eyes endless. In her hands, she carried something new, a branch, stripped of leaves, its bark scorched black. She extended it to Elias. He took it. The branch pulsed in his hand, its core warm and beating. And with it, came the understanding, it was a key. Not one that would open the door, but one that would open him. He stepped forward. And the door did not resist. It unfolded. Inside was darkness. Not absence. Presence. The kind of dark that sees. That remembers. The moment Elias entered, the branch in his hand dissolved into ash, drifting upward like smoke that changed direction midair. The chamber beyond the door was circular, cavernous, impossibly vast. Its walls were made of polished obsidian, but no reflection returned from its surface. And at the center of the chamber, a throne. Or what might once have been one. Now it lay shattered. Broken into pieces across the floor, each fragment humming softly, pulsing with faint red light. Around it, remnants of ritual, bones arranged in spirals, feathers dipped in wax, ropes made from hair, symbols carved into blood-stained cloth. Above the throne, suspended in midair, was a shape. A being. Unformed. It rotated slowly, as though turning on a current only it could feel. Its body was ever-changing, one moment humanoid, the next avian, then nothing but a blur of mouths whispering different names. It held no eyes, no limbs, and yet Elias could feel it watching him. It had waited. Not for rescue. For completion. And Elias, somehow, was the missing piece. He dropped to his knees. Not in surrender. In memory. The images returned in a flood, his life as a child on the farm, the time he spent building a home that would eventually collapse under grief. The war and its silences, the barn, the wolf, the wound. Each moment was laid bare before this being. And with every memory offered, the chamber grew brighter. Not with light, with recognition. The being above the throne began to descend. It did not speak. It merged. With sound. With breath. With him. Elias screamed, though no sound left his mouth. The sensation was beyond pain, beyond joy, a kind of raw unmaking. As if every lie he had ever lived was stripped away, leaving only the truth of who he had always been. A vessel. A bridge. The last of the keepers. And now, the first of the returned. When he rose again, his body glowed faintly, the same amber light that had once filled the walls. His hands were different, etched with living symbols that moved as he moved. The mask no longer existed. It was his face now. Not worn. Born. The forest beyond the doorway had changed. The wolves knelt. The woman, now fully formed, her face visible, bowed her head and spoke aloud for the first time. Her voice was the wind, and the roots, and every tear shed in silence. You have remembered. And the wound of the world shall close. Elias nodded. But he knew. The closing of one wound often opens another. And something had followed him back. High above the between, cracks had begun to form in the sky. Hairline fractures glowing red. Not of this world. Not of any world. But something waiting at the edge of every firelight story, every lullaby meant to keep children asleep. Something ancient. Something hungry. And Elias, reborn, marked, whole, would be its only equal. The return was not like waking from a dream, it was like stepping into a memory someone else had dreamed for you. Elias found himself standing once again in the field behind the barn. The golden-veined door had vanished, the ground seamless, untouched, as though it had never opened. The grass was wet with morning dew, and the sky above was a familiar gray, but beneath its surface, something shimmered. The cracks were faint, but growing. Not obvious to ordinary eyes. But Elias no longer possessed ordinary sight. Where once he had seen fields, now he saw lines, currents of light running beneath the soil, looping around trees, threading through air like veins in a great sleeping body. And above, between the clouds, he saw the tension in the sky, as though something enormous pressed against it from the other side. The wolves were gone. The woman was gone. Only the silence remained, thick, humming, expectant. Elias looked down at his hands. The symbols glowed softly in his skin, shifting beneath it like heat behind ice. They no longer felt alien. They pulsed in time with his heart, and each beat carried not blood alone, but memory, not just of his life, but of many. He could feel the lives of the others who had come before, the weight of their decisions, the roads they chose not to walk. He carried them now. Not as stories. As obligation. That night, Elias stood at the edge of the forest. It was no longer the place he had known for decades. The trees were the same, but the feeling beneath them had changed. The old woods, once passive, once indifferent, now pulsed with intelligence. Roots shifted. Leaves whispered names. The animals that lived there moved differently, aware, careful. As if they too sensed the breath of something vast stirring beneath them. He walked deeper. Toward the hollow tree. The bark had changed. It no longer bore the blackened signs of age. Now it glistened with a strange sheen, almost as though it were healing, or awakening. The hollow within now pulsed with amber light, faint, familiar. He stepped inside. And found the branch. Not the one from the chamber, that had dissolved, but a new one. Crooked. Smooth. Warm. As he touched it, visions flickered at the edge of his mind, a deer frozen in the trees, a storm forming backward in the sky, a girl singing a name that had never been written down. The branch was a staff now. And it was his. A tool. A symbol. A weapon. In town, things were changing. The disappearances had stopped. But not because the forest was safer. No one dared to enter it anymore. Even the rangers had begun to avoid it, muttering about soundless animals, paths that changed, and one who claimed to have seen his own brother, dead for 9 years, watching him from the tree-line. Merrifield felt the shift. Crows gathered on wires and rooftops in numbers too large to ignore. The wind came from directions the weather didn't allow. Old men forgot their own names, then remembered names they had never heard before. Churches remained locked. Dogs barked not at strangers, but at shadows cast by nothing. And in the evenings, the sky cracked a little more. Just hairlines. Just enough. Elias watched it all in silence. He didn't interfere. Not yet. He simply waited. Because he knew what came next. The dreams began on the third night. Not his. The townspeople. They saw the spiral. They saw the door. Some woke screaming. Others wandered into the fields without knowing why, only to wake standing barefoot in the tall grass, whispering names they forgot by morning. A child began drawing the crescent over and over on her bedroom wall, saying she liked the way it hummed. A teenage boy carved a sixth finger into the handprint mural on the school's gymnasium wall and was suspended for vandalism, though he insisted he was just correcting it. The veil was not thinning anymore. It was bleeding. Elias lit a fire in the field. He didn't need warmth. He needed a boundary. The flames formed a circle around him as he planted the staff in the earth. It pulsed in rhythm with the old blood, the ground beneath it darkening. The wind held its breath. The forest stilled. And one by one, the wolves returned. They emerged without sound, their eyes glowing dimly, bodies sleek and dark, shadows given form. They did not growl. They did not bow. They stood with him. And when the wind shifted again, carrying with it the first foul scent of what pressed behind the sky, a sweetness rotted at the core, like flowers growing from bone, Elias knew. It was coming. Not the thing in the throne. Not the woman. Not the wolves. Something else. Something that had followed him back. Something that did not belong in any world, but in the space between them, a presence that fed on crossings, on bridges, and Elias was now the last of those. The staff burned brighter. The spiral in his palm flared. The earth around him shifted. And in the clouds above, a single golden eye opened, wide, lidless, infinite, and stared directly at him. Elias did not look away. He couldn't. Because he remembered now. The wound in the sky had a name. And it had once been his. The eye remained open for 3 nights. It did not blink. It did not shift. It simply stared, unwavering, unmoving, as if the sky itself had decided to judge the world it hovered above. People in town began to fall ill. Not with fever. Not with weakness. But with visions. They wandered the streets in trances, whispering fragments of languages no one had taught them, tracing invisible shapes in the air. A woman wept at the edge of a cornfield, cradling something no one else could see. A boy buried his schoolbooks and said they had told him to go back to the beginning. The police tried to contain the panic, but no law held power against what couldn't be touched. And above it all, the eye continued to watch. It wasn't just seeing. It was remembering. Remembering every fracture in the fabric of the world, every lie built into its foundation, every silence that should have screamed. And in doing so, it reached for the one who had dared to walk between, not just to visit the place beyond, but to return from it. Elias. On the 4th night, the eye wept. A single drop, massive, gold, shimmering, fell from the sky like molten glass and struck the earth just beyond Elias's field. It didn't shatter. It sank. Into the ground. And when it touched soil, the land buckled. Trees groaned and twisted. The fences around the farm snapped in half. Crows burst from the trees in such numbers they darkened the moon. The wolves howled, but not in fear. In mourning. Something had landed that could not be allowed to remain. Elias walked alone into the crater. His staff in hand, the spiral on his palm glowing, his body marked with shifting light. The moment his boots touched the rim, the wind collapsed inward, sucked toward the core as if the world itself were breathing in. At the center, the golden tear pulsed. It no longer looked like a drop. Now it looked like a heart. Not human. Not animal. Something in between. It beat slowly. Loudly. Each pulse echoed through Elias's ribcage, like the memory of a voice not spoken in centuries. He knew better than to touch it. That wasn't what it wanted. It wanted to be touched. It wanted agreement. But Elias didn't move. Instead, he spoke, the first words he had spoken aloud in days. His voice carried not just through the field, but through the layers beneath it. Through the between. Through the bones of the forgotten, the roots of memory. He spoke not with power, but with truth. You are not mine to carry. The earth responded. A groan deep and low, like tectonic bones shifting. The wolves circled the crater, eyes locked on the heart, their bodies tensed. Behind them, the forest trembled, not with fear, but with readiness. The trees leaned forward. The grass shivered. Even the clouds above formed a spiral around the eye still watching. Then, the heart cracked. A thin fracture ran down its side. And from within it poured sound. Not a scream. Not a roar. Memory. But corrupted. Twisted versions of the visions Elias had seen in the between, a woman burning beneath a tree, wolves hunted to extinction, children burying masks in shallow graves. The unwritten past. The unlived truth. The memories that had no place in the world because they threatened its order. They spilled across the field like smoke. One touched Elias. And he staggered. Suddenly, he stood in a hallway, wood-paneled, lit by gas lamps. His wife sat at the end, weeping silently. She looked up, eyes full of ash, and said, "You let it through." Then he blinked, and he was back. Standing once more at the crater's edge. The golden heart now beat faster. It was waking. It had seen him. It had chosen him. Not as vessel. As door. The sky cracked fully that night. Not metaphorically. It broke. A rift opened just above the golden eye, splitting outward like glass struck by a hammer. Through it came something vast. Not in shape. Not in form. In intent. The presence that emerged had no body. It had idea. The concept of hunger. The memory of silence. The shape of despair. It slithered through the sky like shadow wrapped in breath, descending slowly, patiently, toward the crater, toward the heart that called it. Toward Elias. He stepped forward. The staff in his hand burst into light, not fire, not lightning, memory rendered solid. Faces swirled around it, the boy he had been, the woman he'd loved, the wolf who had once died to be reborn. They circled him in radiant silence. And then the voice returned. Not from outside. From within. You must close what you opened. Or you will become its echo. Elias understood. The golden heart had not fallen. It had been thrown. Cast out. Not as punishment. As bait. And he had been the line. He turned to the wolves. They waited, unmoving. Then one by one, they approached the rim, lowering their heads to the soil, forming a ring. The same shape as the chamber. The same shape as the field. Elias stood in the center. He raised the staff. The spiral on his hand aligned with the sky. And for one breathless moment, the world held still. The between opened again. But not beneath. Above. And through it poured every memory the world had ever buried. The wind screamed. The trees bent backward. The field caught fire, but the flames burned downward into the earth, not up. And from the crater, the golden heart lifted. It rose into the air like an unspoken truth, blinding, pulsing, resisting. The presence screamed. But it was too late. Elias stepped into the air. Into the crossing. And became the bridge once more. One last time. He rose slowly, not with effort, but with surrender, like a leaf carried by the breath of the world. Elias no longer felt the ground beneath him. No longer heard the wind. Even the wolves below were like distant thoughts, held gently at the edge of memory. Above, the between had widened. The spiral in the sky now glowed so brightly that stars vanished into it. The golden eye blinked, once, for the first and final time. Then it, too, dissolved, not into darkness, but into remembrance. Because nothing dies in the between. Not truly. Everything returns. And Elias was the return. The golden heart pulsed in front of him, suspended between what was and what would never be again. It beat not like an organ, but like a wound, rhythmic, loud, defiant. Within it, the presence howled. The thing that had crawled through the cracks in memory, feeding on lost names and broken timelines, now writhed in fury. But it could not flee. Elias held it fast, not with strength, but with truth. That was the one thing the darkness could never possess. It could consume. It could mimic. But it could not remember. Because remembering required pain. And Elias had carried pain his whole life. The mask, now part of his flesh, split open. Light poured from his face, from the spiral carved into his chest, from his open palms. All around him, the between began to close, not like a door, but like a mouth sealing after a prayer. The wolves below howled. The forest leaned inward. The earth held its breath. And Elias Harlow, farmer, father, forgotten soul, spoke not with words, but with knowing. You cannot take what was given freely. The golden heart screamed. Not aloud. Not with sound. With memory. Elias saw it all. The first ones, the ones who had formed the pact. They had walked through fire and silence and sacrifice, binding the between to the living world not as a wall, but as a mirror. A way for both sides to remember each other. Not to rule. Not to conquer. But to balance. And someone, something, had broken that pact. Long ago. Elias had never been meant to fix it. Only to remind it that it existed. And now, it had been seen. Truly seen. And in that moment, the golden heart cracked fully. Light, real light, spilled out. Not flame. Not radiance. But the kind of light that lives at the bottom of sorrow. The kind found in a father's last glance. A lover's final breath. A wolf's grateful eyes. It poured through the between, threading through every root, every memory, every lost corner of the world where grief had settled like dust. And the wound began to close. The spiral in the sky turned inward. The crack sealed. The forest breathed again. When Elias fell, he did not hit the ground. He simply landed. On silence. On stillness. The kind of stillness that lives only in the moments after transformation, where something vast has happened, and the world is still adjusting to what it now must become. The wolves gathered around him. They did not touch him. They only watched. His body was still. His eyes were closed. The symbols on his skin faded into scar. The staff lay beside him, its light dimmed, its purpose fulfilled. And then the first wolf, the one he had once saved in the barn all those years ago, stepped forward. It rested its head gently on Elias's chest. A heartbeat. Once. Then silence. He was buried beneath the oldest tree in the field. No stone. No name. Only a ring of feathers, a spiral carved into the bark, and the faint, unending sound of wind that sometimes sounded like wolves howling in harmony with memory. The forest remained quiet after that. No more disappearances. No more visions. Only peace. But on certain nights, when the moon hangs too low, and the air tastes like rain and old stories, people swear they see a figure standing at the edge of the trees. An old man. With a carved staff in hand. And wolves beside him. Watching. Waiting. Not to intervene. Not to return. Only to remember. Because Elias Harlow was never just a man. He was the breath between forgetting and truth. The stillness between life and what comes after. The bridge. The last. And the first.